Prime Minister, appreciate your time today. We've seen a fair bit of flack for you in terms of your trip to Sydney for Father's Day. I want to start with that before we get to other matters in relation to the pandemic. Can you understand why some people look at that trip and think it's unfair, given many families were unable to catch up on Father's Day themselves?
I can understand people's frustration, but I do think that there has been a lot of misinformation about this. I mean, I live in Sydney. I often have to be here for work. There was no requirement to get an exemption to go to Sydney, like all members of Parliament. Parliament session ended on Thursday. I had further meetings here with National Cabinet on Friday, and I returned home. There was no exemption required for me to return home, as I do on any occasion that I do have that opportunity. The exemption I require is to come back here to the ACT. And as Prime Minister, of course, I need to come back to the ACT to have various meetings. There's various secure information that I can only receive directly, access to individuals. It's an important part of my job to be in Canberra. And I'll be heading back home this weekend as well, and later in this week when I'm no longer required to be here in the ACT. So the issue is about having an exemption to be in Canberra. Members of Parliament have all gone back, and I went back to my home like they all did. But it requires me often to be back here in Canberra more often than other ministers. These arrangements have been in place with the ACT to enable ministers, whether it's myself, and indeed if the Leader of the Opposition is required to be here in Canberra, they would get similar treatment.
But isn't it about the fact that so much of the nation, so many of us are doing it tough in terms of not seeing our dads, our granddads, and you're talking about moving between two places that are in lockdown, and you were able to because of your position?
Well, all members of Parliament, and particularly those who have special responsibilities in Canberra, just like essential workers, need to be able to leave their home and go and work in their workplaces, and they have to be subject to testing, just as I'm subject to testing here, just as other ministers and others who've had to be here in Canberra, going back to last year's lockdown in Victoria. I mean, the government still needs to function. And we return home when we're able to return home. That hasn't happened that often this year, I've got to tell you. But, that's the nature of the job, and we all accept that. But the suggestion that somehow this was an unusual arrangement for members of Parliament, indeed ministers, well, that just wouldn't be true.
Bill Shorten
misrepresenting
Mr Shorten, the Labor frontbencher, says that you've been guilty of appalling judgment on this. What do you say to that sort of criticism?
Well, it's a bit of a cheap shot, to be honest. I mean, Bill knows full well what these rules are. In fact, he took advantage of them. 3 weeks, he went home and spent the last 3 weeks rather than being in Parliament because he could return to Victoria. Now, he chose not to come back here to Canberra for the parliamentary sittings. My ministers stayed here, bar one, who had particular family reasons to still remain where they were. But we got on with that job. I mean, Bill knows that. Bill knows that the Prime Minister needs to go backward and forwards between these places to do the work. He understands that secure documents, secure discussions that need to be held. So he knows all of that. And so, frankly, it's a bit of a cheap shot, particularly given the Leader of the Labor Party and I, both understand these arrangements and don't take issue with them. So, it's just cheap politics.
When you look at this broader issue, though, you were asked about the NRL families. I know it's a very different matter, but I guess the perception among many is that there's double standards. If you know the right people, you get special treatment. And you were asked about on 4BC about those families from the NRL, about cricket teams getting exemptions while people who are grieving family members and so on aren't. And you said, well, I share people's frustration about that. No doubt about that. That's what you said last week.
That's right.
Aren't we seeing another episode of people being frustrated by double standards?
Well, if I brought my family here to Canberra outside those rules, I would understand that. But I haven't done that. My family has remained in Sydney in lockdown. I haven't brought them here to Canberra. There has been no special rules or exemptions provided to my family. They've remained there and they've remained separated from me for quite a long period of time. And when the rules enable me to come back to Canberra, having returned home, then they're the rules, as the ACT Chief Minister himself has set out today. So my family has received no special rules. As Prime Minister, I have a job to do, and I'm doing that job, and it requires me to be here.
You're also being accused of not being upfront about it with the Instagram post on the day. For our viewers who aren't familiar with it, it was a post, a very nice photo of you and Jenny and the kids, but it was from many months ago. And the argument is that you were trying to be misleading about that and not being upfront that you actually did go to Sydney for the day. What do you say in response
Well, I
to
think
that?
that's very cynical. I mean, the only official engagement I had on the weekend was the South Australian State Council of the Liberal Party, which I beamed in from Kirribilli House, from a very publicly recognisable office in Kirribilli, and there are journalists who were there in South Australia who saw those images. So
You weren't trying to cover up anything?
no, of course not. I mean, in politics, people like to take a lot of swings at you, and you get pretty used to that. But sometimes those jabs can be low blows.